Adrian Blake was a man who had everything money could buy, and almost nothing that truly mattered. At 42, he owned one of the biggest steel and construction companies in the country. His name was printed in business magazines. His office sat on the 40th floor of a glass tower he had built himself. People who worked for him were scared to knock on his door without a reason. People who did business with him respected him, and some of them feared him too. But at night, when the lights of the city blinked outside his window and the office slowly emptied, Adrian would sit alone at his desk, staring at nothing, feeling a kind of emptiness that no amount of money could ever fill. 3 years earlier, his wife had died in a car accident on a rainy evening. She had gone out to pick up a birthday cake for their daughter, and she never came back. Adrian remembered getting the call while he was still at work, closing a deal that, looking back, meant nothing at all. Since that night, something in him had shut down. He buried himself in work, because work didn't ask questions. Work didn't remind him of her laugh. Work didn't make him feel guilty for not being home enough when she was alive. His daughter Lily was only 6 years old, but she carried a quiet sadness that no child her age should carry. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn silence. She rarely smiled at school. She rarely spoke about her feelings. The house they lived in was huge, with a garden, a swimming pool, and enough rooms for a family 3 times their size, but it always felt empty. Nannies came and went. Tutors taught her math and piano. A cook prepared her meals, but nobody sat with her at the dinner table and asked how her day was. Not really, not in a way that made her feel heard. Adrian loved his daughter more than his own life, but love and presence are 2 very different things, and he knew, somewhere deep inside, that he was failing her. He just didn't know how to fix it. Every time he tried to spend time with her, work would call, an email would arrive, a crisis would happen at one of his construction sites, and he would leave again, promising he would make it up to her later. Later never seemed to come. One morning, everything changed, though it didn't feel like anything special at the time. Adrian was heading to a meeting on the other side of the city, a meeting that could decide whether his company won a massive government contract. Halfway there, his car suddenly stopped working. The engine made a strange sound and then died completely, right in the middle of a street he had never visited before, a street lined with small shops, old buildings, and people going about their simple lives. His driver stepped out, worried, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. Adrian, frustrated and already late, decided to step out too, if only to breathe some air while they waited for a mechanic. Lily was with him that day because her school had a half day, and she had insisted on coming along, tired of being left with yet another nanny. Across the street, there was a small bakery. It wasn't fancy. The sign above the door was slightly faded, and the paint on the walls had begun to peel in places. But the smell coming from inside was warm and sweet, the smell of fresh bread and something like cinnamon. Lily, who had been quiet and bored in the car for the past 20 minutes, suddenly perked up. "Can we go inside, Dad, please?" she asked, tugging at his sleeve. Adrian almost said no. He was in a suit worth more than most people's monthly salary, standing on a street he didn't belong to, worried about a meeting he was about to miss. But something about the hope in his daughter's voice made him give in. Fine, just for a few minutes. Inside the bakery, a young woman was wiping down the counter, her hands dusted with flour, her hair tied back messily, a few loose strands falling across her face. Her apron had a small patch sewn onto it, the kind of patch that told you this apron had been used for years, not just weeks. Her name was Claire, and she had grown up not far from that very street. Claire's life had never been easy. Her parents had passed away when she was young, and she had raised her younger brother mostly by herself, working long hours to make sure he had food, clothes, and a chance to finish school. She had taken over the small bakery from an old woman who used to run it, a woman who had been like a second mother to her. Claire worked from before sunrise until late at night, and even though her hands were often tired and her feet ached by the end of the day, she never let it show on her face. She believed that everyone who walked through that door deserved a smile, whether they could pay full price or not. When Lily walked in, eyes wide and curious, Claire noticed her immediately. There was something about the little girl's face, a kind of loneliness, that Claire recognized because she had felt it too, growing up without parents of her own. "Hello there," Claire said, crouching down to Lily's height. "Would you like to try something sweet? I just took these cookies out of the oven." Lily looked up at her father, silently asking for permission, and Adrian, standing awkwardly near the door, nodded. Claire handed Lily a warm cookie wrapped in a small napkin, refusing to take any money for it. "It's on the house," she said with a warm smile. "New customers get a free taste." Lily took a bite, and for the first time in weeks, Adrian heard his daughter laugh. It wasn't a big laugh, just a small giggle at the way the warm chocolate had melted onto her fingers, but it hit him harder than any business deal ever could. He had almost forgotten what that sound was like. Adrian stood there for a moment, watching his daughter interact so easily with a stranger, something she rarely did even with people she had known for months. He found himself studying Claire, not in the way a man studies a stranger he finds attractive, but in the way someone studies a person who seems to hold a secret he desperately wants to understand. How could someone with so little, working in a small shop on a street most people ignored, radiate this much warmth? "Thank you," he said simply, his voice a little rough from disuse in casual conversation. She hasn't laughed like that in a long time. Claire looked at him for a moment, sensing there was more behind his words than he was saying, but she didn't push. "Kids can tell when something is made with care," she said instead. "Maybe that's all it takes sometimes." The mechanic eventually fixed the car, and Adrian and Lily left, but something had shifted. Lily talked about the bakery the entire ride home, asking if they could go back. Adrian, surprising even himself, said yes. He told himself the visits were for Lily. That was easier to accept than the truth, which was that he, too, found himself thinking about the little bakery during his long, silent hours at the office. He started finding excuses to pass by that street. Sometimes he would send his driver ahead and walk the last block himself, just to feel normal for 5 minutes, just to escape the version of himself that everyone else needed him to be. Over the following weeks, a quiet routine began to form. Adrian would stop by the bakery 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes with Lily, sometimes without her when she was at school. Claire began saving a small piece of bread or a slice of cake for him, without him ever asking. They would talk, sometimes about nothing at all, the weather, the traffic, a customer who had come in earlier that day with a funny story. Other times the conversations went deeper. Claire told him about her brother, a smart, hard-working teenager who dreamed of becoming an engineer one day, though she wasn't sure how she would ever afford to send him to a good college. She spoke about her parents with a mixture of love and grief, about the small house they had left behind, the one she still lived in, the one with a leaking roof she hadn't yet found the money to fix. Adrian, in turn, found himself opening up in ways he hadn't with anyone since his wife had died. He told Claire about the accident, about the guilt that sat in his chest every single day, about how he had thrown himself into work because it was easier than facing an empty house. He told her about Lily's silence, about how he didn't know how to reach his own daughter anymore. Claire never judged him. She never once asked him for anything, not money, not favors, not even a bigger tip than what he already left. She simply listened, the way a real friend listens, without trying to fix everything, without trying to offer advice unless it was asked for. For a man who was constantly surrounded by people who wanted something from him, this honesty was like fresh air after years of being underwater. Lily, too, grew attached to Claire. She would sit at the small wooden table near the counter after school, doing her homework while Claire worked, occasionally getting up to help sprinkle sugar on top of pastries or stir batter in a bowl, careful not to spill. Claire taught her how to shape simple cookies, how to read a recipe, small lessons that seemed unimportant on the surface, but meant the world to a little girl who rarely got to do anything hands-on with the adults in her life. Slowly, the sadness in Lily's eyes began to fade. She started smiling more, not just at the bakery, but at home too. She started asking her father questions about his day, something she hadn't done in a long time. She even began sharing small stories from school without being asked. As the weeks turned into a couple of months, small details about each other's lives began to matter more than either of them expected. Adrian learned that Claire woke up at 4 in the morning every single day, long before the sun rose, to start the ovens so the first batch of bread would be ready by the time the early workers walked past on their way to the factories nearby. He learned that she never took a real day off, that even on the one Sunday a month she closed the shop, she spent it cleaning the equipment, fixing small things that had broken during the week, and helping her brother study for his exams. There was no laziness in her, no sense of waiting for someone else to rescue her from her circumstances. She simply worked, quietly and steadily, the way people do when they've never had the luxury of giving up. Claire, in turn, began to see a side of Adrian that the business magazines never printed. She saw him arrive some evenings still in his suit, tie loosened, eyes tired from back-to-back meetings, and instead of talking about his company, he would ask her questions about her day, really listening to the answers instead of waiting for his turn to speak. He started remembering small things, like the fact that her brother preferred lemon over chocolate, or that she got a headache every time it rained because of an old injury to her wrist she rarely spoke about. He never made a big deal of remembering these details. He simply did. One rainy afternoon, when the street outside was slick and gray and customers were few, Adrian showed up without Lily for the first time in weeks. He sat at the small wooden table near the counter, and instead of talking, he simply watched Claire work for a while, kneading dough with practiced hands, humming softly to herself without realizing it. "Doesn't it get exhausting?" he finally asked. "Doing the same thing every single day for years?" Claire shrugged, not looking up from the dough. "Everything gets exhausting if you only look at the repetition, but I don't just see the same thing every day. I see the little boy who comes in every morning before school because his mother works 2 jobs, and this is the only warm meal he gets before class. I see the old man, who's been coming here since before I was even born, who still tells me stories about how this shop used to look. I see people, Adrian, not just bread." She finally looked up, catching his eye. "I bet running a company isn't so different. Behind every deal, there are people, aren't there? Workers, families, homes, being built. You just don't get to see their faces the way I do." Adrian sat back, struck by how simply she had reframed something he had spent years reducing to numbers on a spreadsheet. He thought about the construction workers on his sites, men and women he had never once spoken to directly, families who depended on his company's success for their next paycheck. He realized, with a strange mixture of shame and clarity, that he had built an empire while forgetting the very people that empire was built on. It was around this time that Adrian's company faced a serious crisis of its own. A major housing project his company had been building for 2 years, meant to provide affordable apartments in a growing part of the city, ran into a dangerous structural problem. Inspectors found cracks in the foundation of one of the buildings, cracks that, if ignored, could put hundreds of future residents at risk. Fixing the problem properly would cost the company an enormous amount of money and delay the project by months, cutting deeply into profits and shaking investor confidence. Adrian's board pushed him to patch the issue quietly and move forward, arguing that the cracks were likely minor and that a full and public fix would tank the company's stock price and scare away future contracts. For the first time in years, Adrian found himself torn between the version of himself that had built his career on ruthless decision-making and the version of himself that was slowly waking up again, thanks to quiet evenings spent listening to a woman who saw people instead of numbers. He mentioned the situation to Claire one evening, not asking for business advice, simply thinking out loud the way he had grown used to doing with her. "If it were your bakery," Claire asked quietly, "and you found out the flour you were using might be bad, might make a handful of your customers sick if you didn't say anything, would you keep selling it because throwing it away would cost you money?" Adrian didn't answer right away, but the question sat with him long after he left the bakery that night. 2 days later, he stood in front of his own board and, against the advice of nearly everyone in the room, announced that the company would delay the project, fix the foundation properly, and personally cover the extra costs from the company's profits rather than cutting corners elsewhere. He held a press conference explaining the decision honestly, admitting the mistake instead of hiding it. To the surprise of many, the public response was overwhelmingly positive. People trusted a company willing to admit fault and fix it properly, far more than one that pretended nothing was ever wrong. It became, quietly, one of the proudest decisions of his entire career, and he knew, without saying it aloud, that it had been shaped by a conversation in a small bakery with a woman who had never studied business in her life but understood people better than anyone he had ever met in a boardroom. One evening, Adrian sat in his office long after everyone else had gone home, staring at a photograph of his late wife that still sat on his desk. He thought about how much lighter Lily had become in the past month, how much of that change traced back to a small bakery and the woman who ran it. And then he thought about himself, about how he too felt different when he was there, lighter, more like a person and less like a machine that closed deals and signed contracts. He wasn't sure what to call the feeling growing inside him, but he knew it scared him because it meant caring again, and caring again meant the possibility of losing something once more. His mother, Eleanor, a sharp and proud woman who had never fully approved of anyone her son cared about, began to notice the change in him too. She noticed he was leaving the office earlier some days. She noticed a new lightness in his voice when he mentioned Lily's improved mood. When she found out, through a family friend who had spotted him at the bakery, that the reason behind all of this was a woman who ran a small shop in a modest part of town, her reaction was immediate and cold. "You built everything you have from nothing," she told him one evening over dinner at the family estate. "You cannot throw away your name, your company's reputation, everything your father worked for, over some infatuation with a girl who sells bread for a living." "She's not just some girl, Mother," Adrian replied, more sharply than he intended. "And I haven't thrown anything away. I've simply found someone who treats Lily and me like actual human beings, not opportunities." Eleanor didn't stop there. Over the following days, she invited Adrian to several dinners at the family estate, each time seating a different well-connected young woman beside him, hoping one of them might catch his interest and quietly end whatever was happening at the bakery before it went any further. Adrian sat through these dinners politely, but his mind kept drifting back to the small wooden table near the counter, to the sound of Lily's laughter, to the easy, unguarded way Claire spoke to him without any agenda hidden behind her words. He realized, somewhere between the third course and the awkward small talk, that none of these polished conversations came close to how alive he felt during a simple afternoon spent watching Claire flour her hands and tell stories about her customers. "You're not even listening," Eleanor snapped one evening, after catching him staring blankly at his plate for the third time that dinner. "Adrian, I am not trying to control your life. I am trying to protect it. People like us, we don't get the luxury of simply following our hearts wherever they wander. There are responsibilities, a name to uphold, a company that thousands of families depend on. What happens to all of that if the public decides you've lost your judgment over a woman from a bakery? And what happens to Lily?" Adrian replied quietly, "if she grows up watching her father choose reputation over happiness, the same way I once chose work over spending time with her mother while she was still alive?" The room went silent after that. Eleanor didn't have an answer, not one she was willing to say out loud, and though she didn't fully accept his choice that night, something in her rigid posture softened, just slightly, enough for Adrian to notice. Eleanor wasn't the only one who disapproved. There was another woman in Adrian's circle, a woman named Vanessa, the daughter of one of his father's oldest business partners. For years, it had been quietly assumed, mostly by the older generation, that Vanessa and Adrian would eventually end up together. She was elegant, sharp, well-educated, and came from a family with money and influence to match his own. She had waited patiently through his marriage, through his period of grief, believing that eventually, when he was ready to move on, she would be the natural choice. When Vanessa heard the rumors about a woman from a bakery capturing Adrian's attention, something inside her twisted with jealousy and disbelief. It wasn't just about losing Adrian, It was about losing to someone she saw as beneath her, someone with no name, no fortune, no status. She told herself she was protecting Adrian's reputation, protecting his family's legacy, but underneath that excuse was simple, ugly envy. Vanessa began quietly gathering information about Claire, hiring someone to dig into her background, hoping to find something she could use. She found out about Claire's younger brother, a good kid who, years earlier, had gotten into a minor scuffle at school defending a friend from bullies, a small incident that had been resolved quietly at the time. Vanessa twisted this small, forgivable moment into something far bigger. Hinting to a gossip columnist, she knew that Claire's family had a history of trouble, that Claire herself might be getting close to Adrian for his money, planning to use his wealth to bail her brother out of some imaginary future trouble. The story that eventually appeared in a widely read gossip column was cruel and mostly untrue, painting Claire as a scheming woman using a sad little bakery as bait to trap a grieving billionaire. It suggested her brother had a troubled past and hinted, without directly saying it, that the whole friendship with Lily had been a calculated move to get closer to Adrian's fortune. The story spread quickly, the way these things often do. Adrian's board members grew nervous about the company's public image. Reporters started showing up outside the bakery, snapping photos, shouting questions at Claire whenever she stepped outside. Customers who had visited for years suddenly started staying away, whispering among themselves, believing the headlines instead of the woman they had known for a decade. Claire was heartbroken, not because of what strangers thought of her, but because of what it might do to her brother, who was innocent and had done nothing wrong except make one small mistake as a 14-year-old defending someone weaker than him. She watched her business slow down. She watched neighbors who used to greet her warmly now avoid eye contact. And through it all, she waited for Adrian to say something, to defend her publicly, to show that he trusted her over a stranger's twisted story. But Adrian, still carrying old wounds from losing his wife, still afraid deep down of being fooled or hurt again, hesitated. He didn't fully believe the rumors, but he also didn't immediately dismiss them either. He asked Claire about her brother's past in a tone that, though he didn't mean it to sound accusing, came across exactly that way. "Is it true?" he asked one evening, standing in the small bakery after closing hours, his voice tense. "About your brother." Claire's face fell, not out of guilt, but out of disappointment. There was one incident, years ago, when he was 14. He stood up for a friend who was being bullied. That's it. That's the whole story they twisted into something ugly. She paused, studying his face carefully. "Do you actually believe I would use my own bakery, use Lily, to trap you into something? After everything I've told you, after everything we've shared?" "I don't know what to believe anymore," Adrian admitted, and the words, though honest, cut deeper than he realized. Claire stood a little straighter, pride mixing with hurt in her eyes. "Then maybe you should figure that out on your own," she said quietly. "Because I'm not going to spend my time convincing a man to trust me. Either you know who I am by now, or you don't." He left that night without another word, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't return the next day, or the day after that. The weeks that followed were hard for both of them, though neither said it out loud to anyone else. Claire threw herself into work, trying to ignore the empty feeling that settled in her chest every time the bell above the bakery door rang and it wasn't Adrian or Lily walking in. Her brother, sensing her sadness, tried to comfort her in small ways, bringing her tea in the evenings, sitting with her quietly instead of filling the silence with questions. "You don't have to explain anything to people who don't already believe in you," he told her one night, surprising her with how mature he sounded. "If he can't see the truth, that's on him, not you." Claire smiled weakly and hugged her brother, grateful for him, even as her heart still ached. Adrian, meanwhile, was miserable in a different way. Work no longer offered the escape it once did. Every empty hour reminded him of the warmth he had grown used to at the bakery, warmth he had walked away from out of fear and old wounds. To make matters worse, the bad publicity had scared away enough customers that Claire fell behind on rent for the first time in years. Her landlord, A stern man named Mr. Powell, who owned 3 buildings on that street, had never particularly liked her, resenting the fact that she had turned down his nephew's offer to buy the bakery from her 2 years earlier. He used the drop in her income as an excuse to threaten eviction, giving her 30 days to pay what she owed or lose the shop entirely. Claire didn't tell anyone at first, not even her brother, carrying the weight of it quietly the way she carried most things. She spent her nights doing the math over and over, trying to figure out which bills could wait and which couldn't, whether she could take out a loan without losing the shop as collateral, whether 30 days was enough time to somehow turn things around. She thought, briefly and painfully, about calling Adrian, about how easily he could solve this problem with a single phone call. But pride, and the memory of the doubt in his eyes the last time they had spoken, stopped her every time she picked up her phone. Instead, she worked harder than ever, baking extra batches of bread to sell at a discount to a nearby shelter, hoping the goodwill would bring people back through word of mouth. She took on extra hours cleaning offices at night, a job she hadn't done since she was 19, just to make sure she had enough to cover at least part of what she owed. Her brother found out eventually, catching her counting coins late one night at the kitchen table, and he immediately offered to drop out of his after-school tutoring program to get a part-time job instead. "Absolutely not," Claire told him firmly, sliding the coins back into their jar. "You are going to finish school and get into a good college, even if I have to sell this bakery brick by brick to make it happen." That was never up for discussion. "But it's not fair," her brother argued, his voice cracking with frustration. "You've given up everything for me. Why can't I help, just once?" Claire pulled him into a hug, the kind she used to give him when he was small and scared of thunderstorms. "You help me every single day, just by working hard and staying out of trouble and making something of yourself. That's the only help I need from you. Let me handle the rest." Word of Mr. Powell's threat eventually reached the same reporter who had first run the false story about Claire, though this time, having learned the truth about Vanessa's manipulation, he felt a pang of guilt strong enough to write a follow-up piece, this one honest and sympathetic, describing the real Claire, the woman who fed hungry schoolchildren for free and had been unfairly dragged through the mud months earlier. The article helped a little, bringing a handful of new customers through her door, out of curiosity or sympathy, but it wasn't nearly enough to close the gap before her 30 days ran out. Lily noticed her father's mood shifting back to how it had been before, quiet, distant, tired all the time. She noticed they no longer visited the bakery, and when she asked why, Adrian struggled to find an answer that made sense even to himself. One evening, as Adrian sat at the dinner table barely eating, Lily finally spoke up in the direct way only children seem capable of. "Did you make Claire sad?" she asked, staring at her plate. Adrian looked up, startled. "Why would you think that?" "Because you're sad too," Lily said simply. "And you only get like this when someone we care about goes away." She paused, twisting her fork in her hands. "I heard the ladies at school talking. Their moms said bad things about Claire, but Claire never lied to us. She never asked us for anything. She made our house feel less empty. Why did you stop believing her?" Her words, simple and unfiltered, hit Adrian harder than any board meeting or business failure ever had. He realized, sitting there across from his 6-year-old daughter, that he had let fear and rumors do exactly what he had promised himself he would never let happen again: push away someone genuinely good because trusting people felt too dangerous. That night, unable to sleep, Adrian decided to find out the truth himself, properly, instead of relying on gossip columns and secondhand whispers. He hired someone he trusted completely to investigate where the story had actually come from. It didn't take long to trace it back to Vanessa, to the reporter she was friendly with, to the way small, harmless facts about Claire's brother had been deliberately twisted into something scandalous. Adrian confronted Vanessa directly, requesting a private meeting at his office. She tried at first to deny any involvement, but when he laid out the evidence his investigator had gathered, messages, phone records, the reporter's own admission under pressure from Adrian's legal team, her calm composure finally cracked. "I did it because I care about you," Vanessa said, her voice rising with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Because I've known you your entire life. Because our families belong together. Because that woman doesn't understand your world and never will." "You don't get to decide who understands my world," Adrian replied, his voice steady but cold. "And you certainly don't get to destroy an innocent person's life and business because you're jealous. What you did wasn't protection, Vanessa. It was cruelty." He made it clear, in front of the same board members who had worried about the company's reputation, that the entire scandal had been manufactured, a lie built on a distorted story about a 14-year-old boy defending his friend. The truth, once it came out fully, quickly changed the public's opinion. The same gossip columns that had once painted Claire as a schemer now ran stories about how she had been wrongly targeted, how her small bakery had survived years of hard work and honest kindness, only to be attacked by baseless rumors. But knowing the truth wasn't enough for Adrian. He knew he had failed Claire long before Vanessa's lies ever reached the public. He had let his own fear speak louder than his trust in someone who had never given him a reason to doubt her. He drove to the bakery late one evening, the same street where his car had broken down months earlier, though this time nothing was wrong with the engine. He simply needed to see her. The shop was quieter than usual, a few regular customers slowly returning after the truth had come out. But Claire's smile, though present, didn't quite reach her eyes the way it used to. "I'm not here to ask you to forgive me right away," Adrian said, standing near the door, his hands in his pockets, feeling more nervous than he had felt during any business negotiation in his entire career. "I know I hurt you. I know I let fear make decisions that trust should have made instead. I found out the truth about what Vanessa did, and I made sure everyone else knows it too. But that doesn't erase the fact that when it mattered most, I doubted you instead of standing beside you." Claire wiped her hands on her apron, staring at him for a long moment. "It's not really about the rumors, Adrian," she finally said. "People can say all kinds of things, and I've learned to live with that over the years. What hurt was that you, of all people, the one person who knew me, who sat here for months, listening to my stories, still doubted me the moment things got difficult. That's what I needed you to understand." "I do understand," Adrian said quietly. "And I'm not asking you to trust me again, just because I said sorry. I know words are easy. I just want the chance to show you, over time, that I mean it." He didn't push further that night. He simply asked if he could still come by, not as someone trying to win her back immediately, but as someone willing to earn it slowly, the way real trust is built, one honest day at a time. Claire, cautious but not entirely closed off, agreed to let him try. Over the following weeks, Adrian showed up not with expensive gifts or grand gestures, but with small, consistent actions. He noticed the bakery's old oven had been struggling for months, sometimes burning one side of the bread while leaving the other undercooked. Without making a big announcement, he arranged for it to be repaired properly, paying for it quietly and only telling Claire after the work was already done, refusing to let her feel like it was some kind of payment for her affection. He also learned, quite by accident, about Mr. Powell's threat to take the bakery away, when he overheard Claire's brother mentioning it to a friend on the phone one evening. He didn't march in and buy the building outright, sensing that such a move might feel more like control than kindness. Instead, he quietly looked into the lease agreement and discovered that Mr. Powell had, for years, been overcharging several small shop owners on that street, violating a local rent control rule that most of them didn't even know existed. Adrian connected Claire, along with two of her neighboring shop owners who were facing similar struggles, with a tenants' rights lawyer who worked pro bono for cases exactly like this. Within weeks, not only was Claire's eviction threat canceled, but Mr. Powell was ordered to refund a portion of the excess rent he had collected over the years, money that gave Claire enough breathing room to pay off her back rent and even set a little aside in savings for the first time in a long while. When Claire found out what Adrian had done, careful and behind the scenes, never once making her feel like a charity case, something in her began to soften in a way that surprised even her. He started spending time with Claire's younger brother too, not in a way that felt like charity, but genuinely, sitting with him in the evenings, helping him with difficult math problems, talking to him about engineering, sharing stories from his own early career struggles before he became successful. He didn't offer to pay for college outright, sensing that Claire's family had too much pride to accept something that felt like a handout. Instead, he helped the boy apply for a scholarship program his own company sponsored, one that judged applicants purely on merit, giving him a fair chance to earn his place, rather than simply be given one. Lily, delighted that they were visiting the bakery again, became an unexpected bridge between the two adults, chattering happily about her day, pulling Claire and her father into the same conversations, the same small moments, slowly rebuilding the comfort that had once come so naturally between them. Little by little, the walls Claire had built after the heartbreak began to soften. She watched Adrian show up, day after day, not because he wanted something from her, but simply because he wanted to be there. She watched him apologize not just with words but with patience, giving her the space she needed instead of demanding forgiveness on his own timeline. One quiet evening, months after that difficult night at the bakery, Adrian asked Claire to take a walk with him after closing. They walked along the same street where they had first met, past the spot where his car had broken down all those months ago. "I used to think I had built a good life," Adrian said, looking around at the small shops, the ordinary people walking home after long days of work. "Big house, successful company, more money than I could ever spend, but none of it meant anything until I met you and realized what I had been missing this whole time wasn't more success. It was simply someone who saw me as a person, not a name on a building." He paused, turning to face her fully. "I'm not perfect, Claire. I made a mistake that hurt you, and I know I'll probably make other mistakes in the future. But I know, without any doubt, that I don't want to face any of it without you by my side." Claire, her eyes glistening but her voice steady, finally let herself smile the way she used to before everything had gone wrong. "I never needed you to be perfect," she said. "I just needed you to choose to trust me, even when it was difficult, and you finally did." They didn't rush into anything grand after that. Their relationship grew slowly, naturally, built on the same honesty that had drawn them together in the first place. Claire continued running her bakery, refusing to give it up even after Adrian offered, gently and without pressure, to help her expand it if she ever wanted to. She eventually agreed to open a second small location, not because she needed the money, but because it gave her the chance to hire a few more people from the neighborhood who needed steady work, just as the old woman before her had once given Claire her own start. A year after that quiet evening walk, Adrian and Claire were married in the same bakery where they had first met, decorated simply with fresh flowers and warm lights instead of expensive decorations. Lily, now happier and more talkative than she had been in years, stood proudly between them as they exchanged vows, holding a small basket of flower petals she scattered along the floor with great seriousness. Claire's brother, now attending college on the scholarship he had earned through his own hard work, gave a short, nervous speech that made everyone in the room laugh and wipe away a few tears at the same time. Even Eleanor, Adrian's mother, who had once been so firmly against the relationship, found herself softened by watching how happy her son and granddaughter had become, offering Claire a quiet, sincere apology of her own before the ceremony began. The wedding wasn't covered by any major magazine. There were no red carpets, no rows of photographers waiting outside. It was small, warm, and real, filled with the smell of fresh bread drifting in from the kitchen. Exactly the kind of celebration that suited who they truly were, not who the world expected a billionaire's wedding to look like. In the years that followed, life wasn't perfect, because no life ever truly is. There were still busy seasons at work that pulled Adrian away longer than he wanted, still tired evenings at the bakery that left Claire exhausted, still ordinary disagreements that every married couple faces from time to time. But there was also laughter that filled the house now, real laughter, the kind that echoes through hallways and makes empty rooms feel alive. Lily grew into a confident, warm-hearted girl, no longer defined by the quiet sadness she carried as a small child. in large part because she had two parents now who showed up for her, not just financially, but emotionally, every single day. 5 years passed, and the small house Claire had grown up in was no longer standing empty most of the year, gathering dust while she lived elsewhere. Instead, she and Adrian had turned it into a small community kitchen, run mostly by volunteers from the neighborhood, offering free breakfast to school children and elderly residents who lived alone. It wasn't a large operation, nothing that made headlines or won awards, but every morning, the smell of warm bread drifted out onto the street, just as it always had, feeding people who needed it most. Lily, now 11 years old, had grown into the kind of child who spent her weekends at the bakery not because she was told to, but because she genuinely loved being there, learning new recipes, chatting with regular customers by name, remembering little details about their lives the same way Claire always had. She had started, quietly and without anyone pushing her, to keep a small notebook where she wrote down simple recipes of her own, dreaming, in the way children do, about maybe running her own little corner of the bakery one day. Claire's brother graduated at the top of his engineering class, and on the day of his graduation, he stood at the podium and gave a speech about his sister, about the sacrifices she had made without ever complaining, about how she had taught him that real strength wasn't about never struggling, but about refusing to let struggle turn you bitter. Claire sat in the audience, tears streaming freely down her face, Adrian's hand resting gently over hers, Lily leaning her head against her shoulder. It was one of those rare, perfect moments that people spend their whole lives hoping to experience even once. Adrian, too, had changed in ways that went far beyond his personal life. The company he ran no longer measured its success only in profit margins and stock prices. Following the honesty he had learned to practice with Claire, he began pushing his business toward projects that genuinely helped the communities they were built in: affordable housing done properly, fair wages for construction workers, transparent dealings with the cities and towns his company worked in. Some investors grumbled about slower short-term profits, but Adrian no longer measured his success purely by their approval. He had learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that the version of success worth chasing was the kind that let him sleep peacefully at night and come home to a family who was genuinely glad to see him walk through the door. Even Vanessa, in her own way, eventually moved past the bitterness that had once consumed her. She left the city for a few years, and when she returned, older and a little humbled by life's own lessons, she ran into Claire by chance at a charity event Adrian's company had organized. To everyone's surprise, including her own, she offered a quiet, genuine apology, admitting that jealousy had blinded her to the kind of person Claire truly was. Claire, never one to hold on to grudges longer than necessary, accepted the apology simply and moved on, choosing peace over resentment, the same way she had chosen kindness over bitterness her entire life. Adrian often thought back to that morning his car had broken down, how frustrated he had been at the time, how close he had come to simply waiting inside the vehicle instead of stepping out to explore a street he had never noticed before. It amazed him sometimes, thinking about how one small, unplanned moment, a broken engine on an ordinary street, had ended up changing the entire course of his life. He had spent years believing that success meant building bigger buildings, signing bigger deals, growing his company larger than anyone else's. It took a woman with flour on her hands and patched apron to teach him that the real measure of a good life wasn't the size of what you owned, but the depth of what you felt and who you shared it with. Claire, for her part, never forgot where she came from, even as her small bakery slowly grew into something bigger, eventually becoming known throughout the city, not because of Adrian's money behind it, but because of the same warmth and honesty she had always poured into her work. She often told newer employees, especially the young ones who reminded her of herself at that age, tired and unsure if hard work would ever truly pay off, that kindness was never wasted, even when it felt like it went unnoticed. Somewhere, someday, it would matter to exactly the right person, at exactly the right time. On quiet evenings long after the bakery had closed and Lily had gone to bed, Adrian and Claire would sometimes sit together on the small bench outside the shop, the same bench where they had shared countless simple conversations over the years, watching the street grow dim as the last of the evening light faded away. There was no need for grand declarations anymore, no need for either of them to prove anything to the other. There was only the comfortable quiet of two people who had chosen each other, not out of convenience or circumstance, but through hardship, honesty, and the slow, steady work of real love. "Do you ever regret it?" Claire asked him once, half joking, half serious. "Falling for a girl who sells bread instead of someone from your own world?" Adrian laughed softly, pulling her a little closer. "The only thing I regret," he said, "is that it took a broken car engine to finally show me what I was missing my whole life." And so, what started as a simple, unplanned stop at a small bakery on an ordinary street became the beginning of a life neither of them could have imagined, proof that sometimes the most powerful changes in life don't come from carefully planned decisions, but from small, quiet moments of kindness that neither person realizes at the time are about to change everything.